So welcome to our study of Professor Steven Goodman's The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening, which is essentially a study of the Abhidharma, which is a very important section of the Buddhist teaching, which really speaks about the whole dimension of us, of our psychology and all the conditions really that are basic to our not just really psychological experience, but our experience of reality altogether. So it's a very helpful mapping of our experience and reality. And in the context then of the study, we've been covering areas like what is essentially known as the dhatus, which is essentially the interplay between subject, object, and the consciousness that is generated on the basis of that. So in that way, the entire realm, the entire sensory realm of what we perceive as external objects, as well as also our experience, our mental experience, is all understood in terms of essentially what Stephen was describing as 6 channels, which are the 5 senses and then also the realm of our psychological experience, consciousness. And this is all taking place within essentially then this threefold modality of the object, the perceiving faculties that we possess as subjects, and then also the consciousness that is generated in that regard. And so in terms of us mapping and identifying our, you could say, sentient experience, it's very helpful to appreciate how our psychology, how our experience, how our moods, and the whole array really of what belongs to our first-person subjective experience really is constituted in terms of this interplay between the subject, the object, and also within the subject then the actual faculties and then also the consciousnesses that are generated in this regard. Now, having sort of established that you can say the mechanics of experience, then we're presently looking at then the mental factors that are associated with this. And this, of course, has much more to do with the mind itself. And that's where we're looking at then the 51 mental factors. And we've looked at the we've looked at the 5 the 5 ever-present mental factors. And then also we've looked at, the 5 ever-present mental factors, and then also the 5 basic categories of the, let's see here, object-determined factors. So one is really what we undergo in terms of our subjective experience, and also the other is to do with the objects that we are perceiving. But we should take into regard that while we are talking about universal phenomena, we are also here in the context of the Abhidharma really looking in terms of the process of the path. And of course, what is the objective of Abhidharma is really ultimately the objective of awakening. So it's not just that we are mapping what happens to us psychologically, but we're doing that very much from the point of view of what are the contributing factors to awakening. And this actually becomes then much more pronounced now in terms of the present chapters, which is what we refer to as wholesome mental factors. Of course, the notion of wholesomeness is always a little bit sort of poo-pooed in modernity and a little bit sort of associated with goody two-shoes, and in that sense, not really regarded as a serious consideration. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that when it comes to something like character, we are actually shaped by various choices that we make. And so in terms of, you could say, the conditions for a character of, let's say, integrity, or a character of strength, a character of happiness, and so forth, it's very clear that there are particular laws really that govern this kind. So while we very often associate this within a discourse of morality and absolutes, in the Buddhist teaching, we don't say there's absolutely this that is right or absolutely that which is wrong, etc. We identify how anything really has its value on the basis of the attitude and the motivation behind. But there is definitely there are definitely laws, and there's definitely knowledge associated with seeing what it is that's helpful in terms of yes, character, in terms of the path particularly. So that's what we're looking at now, and we're talking about then 11 wholesome factors which the Abhidharma identifies, and these are then what we refer to as, and I'm just going to use the terms from the Gateway to Knowledge, which is faith, conscience, shame, non-attachment, non-aggression, non-delusion, diligence, pliancy, conscientiousness, equanimity, and non-violence. So all of these really constitute factors which we don't just see them as passively as part of who we are, or factors that we might possess or not possess. They have a lot to do with qualities that we can cultivate. So we're very much seeing this in terms of a proactive process where we're working with cultivating these specific factors. So getting back to Steven's book then, he writes, now we come to a consideration of Abhidharma categories regarding so-called wholesome and unwholesome factors of existence. So far, we've explored in the same order of discussion found in works by Vasubandhu and other Abhidharma-inspired texts, general and objective specific factors of experience. But of course, we do things with our own minds other than simply being aware of objects. We get involved in them in ways that make things go well and in ways that make things go poorly. So again, coming back to the point also I was making before, Abhidharma does consist of mapping the mind, but not just in terms of, you could say, the passively identifying the mind, but also understanding what we do with the mind. So there's a notion of you could say, a proactive choice. And this, of course, also comes back to the notion of free will. In the Buddhist teaching, we're aware of conditioning, and we're aware of how certain factors obviously drive our impulses and drive our choices and so on. But there's also the notion of flexibility. And this is, of course, where Vipassana comes into the picture, because it's on the basis of Vipassana that there's a certain sense of, I saw we were using the word pliancy, there's a certain flexibility. There's a certain element of what Vipassana means, which is an aerial perspective, a greater perspective, in which we are not only aware intellectually what is the more helpful thing to do or not, but we're also not subject or driven by impulses to the same extent. There's an awareness in the mind that enables us to have the freedom to actually make choices not only based on our urges or impulses, but also on the basis of awareness. So with the practice of Vipassana, there's this greater fluidity, and as such, then the issue of choices becomes very pertinent in terms of making the right choices. So Steven then goes on to say, now we move on to a discussion of styles of attention and distraction, ways of getting involved in focusing the mind. We first look at 11 wholesome or good factors before examining the unwholesome or bad news factors. Oh yeah, that was good news. Good news and bad news. Okay.
Before, everything seems sort of quite positive and all the rest of it, except shame was plopped in there. Is there a reason for that?
We'll get to that. Shame is regarded as a quality, and it has a lot. The question is that we and Steven actually brings this up, because in contemporary discourse, okay, to go back to the list, we had shame, right? By the way, this is a screenshot of my Word document where spell check obviously had a lot of problems with these, and the little red underlinings have nothing to do, except they're just that's just my spell check. So so anyway, yes, shame is regarded as as the way that we handle ourselves. There's an interesting phrasing of this. It's actually where we place ourselves as the norm, and it's juxtaposed to the next one. No, sorry. Shame is regarded as where we place the other as the norm. Like, for example, I mean, in modernity, it's different, but particularly in Buddhist cultures and also in Asian cultures, there's a huge awareness of actually how you're very sensitive to the others and the sort of social context. So, for example, if you have a messy front yard, right? Then in the modern context, very often we'd say, well, that's my problem. If I want to have a messy front yard, that's up to me, right? But very often you would also have this sense of shame in which you're thinking, well, everybody else on the street has a very nice, tidy front yard. I should actually feel shame if I don't abide by that. So it's very much decorum in the view of others. In fact, also the Leschly Karamura in the Mind in Buddhist Psychology, he uses the term decorum for that. So that's shame, and like I said, so that's in view of others. And then this is interesting, since we're talking about it, the other one juxtaposed to that is the one that sets ourselves as the norm. And that's basically, do I want to face myself in the mirror if I do a particular thing, right? So nobody might be looking, but we might do something that we feel uncomfortable about. So that's where we have this notion of conscience, and Leschly Karamura has self-respect. So that's where these two play in. Anyway, we'll get to that. So Steven says, remember that all of these factors have one thing in common. They are all the basic building blocks of the universe. They are factors of existence. They are the energy packets, and they constitute us and our world. As such, one would expect to find a listing and description of not only basic cognition and processes of attention, but also listings and descriptions of wholesome and unwholesome factors. As we've said before, karma seems to go in two different ways. Things are either going well or they're not. If we cultivate the factors called good or wholesome, it will result in situations of ease, spaciousness, and relaxation. So that's presently what we're essentially addressing here, factors that are wholesome or that are essentially causes of feeling well. So that's essentially how we can understand the law of karma in terms of actions that actually become part of our identity. They lay down patterns within our consciousness, and they then, you could say, stay with us. So he says, eventually, a good thought bears as its fruit, sometime in the future, an experience of well-being. A bad thought, an unwholesome thought, will bear as its fruit an upsetting or painful experience. So we're not even particularly, I mean, we do talk about good and bad, but it's really just like, you could say, weeds. A weed is really only a plant that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so, of course, there's nothing that is absolutely bad or absolutely good, but it's really just in terms of our particular objective, which generally just obviously would be that we'd like to experience happiness. So that's where the issue of good karma comes into play. Wholesomeness is defined in the Buddhist traditions as that which truly moves us away from tendencies towards suffering. That's the concise way it's defined. Wholesome means truly moving along the path of cessation of suffering. That's incidentally also where we come across the term punya, which can be translated as merit. And this we very often see in Buddhist cultures. People are very keen to gain merit. If you travel in Chinese cultures, there'll be a lot of emphasis on going to the temple, making offerings to get more merit. And what essentially is the objective behind that is creating good conditions for future happiness. And that is really, strictly speaking, we could say that's good karma. But merit, strictly speaking, are the conditions we put into place when we, the conditions we put into place on the basis of wishing to be free. And that's not necessarily just being comfortable in the future. It's really just the aspiration that may the conditions for achieving freedom become, you could say, may they arise. And that's where the conditions for our freedom could actually well be that we go through suffering. And as a result of suffering, we're actually prompted to deal with that. And so merit is aspiring to freedom. And as such, of course, there's merit that is created through the practice of meditation, through the practice of generosity, the practices of the paramitas and all of that. Yes, it's merit, but it is more than just good karma. It's really creating a wider perspective in terms of letting go of our grasping at a self. Karma is not necessarily free from grasping at a self. It's really just ensuring that the self will be comfortable. But merit is really the conditions in place for us actually awakening. And so that's where the path very much emphasizes the value of actions that have enlightenment or awakening as its aspiration. So there's a lot of overlap between good karma and merit, but they are different in that sense. So that's where Steven also here is talking about wholesome actions, pretty much touching on both aspects of both merit and also good karma. Wholesome, he says, means that which, when cultivated, moves us out of a narrow way of being and suffering and along the path toward full and complete enlightenment. That's the sole criterion of judging, and only secondarily does it have something to do with social norms and standards. And that's, of course, also where we have a heritage in the modern world where we've disregarded a lot of the theistic traditions with their absolutes and see things from a much more complex perspective, so that we don't really necessarily have absolute goods and bads. But again, and that's also Steven's point here, that this does not necessarily have anything to do with these social practices. So then, wholesome factors. So then we have them listed here. And then Steven says, after a consideration of these wholesome factors, we will explore the unwholesomeness factors, first the primary ones and then the secondary ones. So primary, for example, could just be raw anger, and then secondary to that could be resentment or irritation, etc., etc. Anyway, he says, at that point, we will come to see that unwholesomeness is anything that blocks, suppresses, or mystifies our movement along the path to the cessation of suffering. And when I say mystify, I mean being conditioned by something that does not correspond to reality. It's blocking wholesomeness. And that's actually also, that has to do a lot with what we in the general Buddhist path refer to as obscurations, which is essentially a naive view of seeing reality. That's where we very often attribute value or solidity to things that actually don't possess any such. We might, for example, have sort of very ordinary example might be that I'd be very happy if I ate that big Danish. And once we're halfway through our Danish, we already feel sick. Be warned, I speak of a lifetime of experience here. So appearances can be deceptive, right? So of course, in the Buddhist context, and when we talk about vipassana and prajna and all of that, of course, we are identifying that what appears as a solid world is, if we investigate it, in fact, just a set of causes and conditions, what we call praticca samutpada, or the web of dependent arising. So that's where our perception of things as solid do not correspond to the reality of things, which is, in fact, a fluid web of causes and conditions. So this is then where Steven then refers to this as mystification. So he says then, and sort of deepening this, he said, this is why wrong view is an unwholesome factor. And this, of course, wrong view, again, sounds like absolutes, but it really, when we say wrong view in the Buddhist context, it's just essentially just being naive about the way things actually are. So it's more sort of just not really, you could say, being in touch with reality that's behind the notion of wrong view. And he says, anything that increases our habits of suffering is unwholesome. Parenthesis, the words good and bad are a bit heavy, and evil certainly does not apply in these Buddhist contexts. Okay, important point here. The key point throughout these explorations is how we are with our mind, our habits of attention, and our awareness. In the Dhammapada, there is a phrase that is worthy of continued reflection in this regard. So it says in the Dhammapada, we are what we think, having become what we thought. And that's sort of very much along the lines of good old macrobiotics that would say you are what you eat, right? So we are essentially, we're constructs on the basis of essentially what we think. This again is interesting because we would say that what we are presently is a result of our former actions, which is, we can sort of verify that empirically, right? What we will be in the future, because we sometimes speculate, what will we be in the future? And we very often have this sort of idea, there's some destiny, there's some fate waiting for me. And there we would say, what we are presently is the result of what we did in the past. What will come in the future is the result of our present actions. So there's a lot of empowerment in the sense of what we if we want to be something in the future, well, this is actually the present moment is actually our opportunity for shaping ourselves. And that's also why the notion of karma in no way designates some sort of deterministic or idea of things are just going to be in one particular way. It's entirely up to us. Of course, again, we are conditioned by particular patterns, but these patterns, like I was saying before, very often through, or in general, through the increase of insight, prajna or vipassana, there's greater ability to choose in a more constructive manner. Anyway, Steven then says, so let's now go through these wholesome factors one by one. So the first is faith and confidence. Faith, confidence, or trust. The first wholesome factor, shraddha, is translated as confidence, trust, or faith. The Abhidharma Kosha talks of having mental certainty, a clarity, and surety. Okay, so what we call trust, confidence, and faith, it's very often inspired, you could say, on the basis of an initial encounter. It could be somebody we meet and we just trust the person. There's just some signals that go out from it. It inspires some sense of integrity. It could also be that we're driving past Sydney Uni and we look in at those beautiful sandstone buildings and think, gosh, there must be some very meaningful sort of stuff going on in there. And this kind of initial trust is what we call clear trust. And this is then consolidated by further certainty when we actually get to know a person, and then we actually, on the basis of knowing that person, we discover this person is trustworthy. And our sort of initial inspiration or faith has been confirmed. And the similar also, if we sort of come across something like a university and we sort of think something meaningful is going on in there, if we then actually begin to find out what does go on, then this further might consolidate our trust in the whole enterprise. And of course, here it applies in the context of the Buddha, his teaching, and the Buddhist community. So that's where Steven said it's not faith so much as being clear about the three things: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. If we have mental clarity about what the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha means, this factor is called confidence. This factor called confidence is present. It has nothing to do with believing or having faith in the sense of blind allegiance or superstition. Such a sense would, in fact, seem to go against basic Buddhist understanding of wholesomeness. And this, of course, is also then where we would never really engage with the Buddhist teaching. And this, of course, the Buddha himself in the Kalama Sutra, where the Buddha encourages people to please not accept his teachings on the basis of just trust, but on the basis of their own inquiry. And this is also a point that Chögyam Trungpa often makes, is that the problem with blind faith is that it might be simple, and very often we who people who come to Buddhism, they sort of like, they almost say, please just tell me what I'm supposed to believe. I think the Dalai Lama is wonderful, and I like the Tibetans, so I like the Buddhist communities. Just tell me what I should what I should be doing. And that's of course very nice, but it's essentially a very simple-minded faith. And that's where in the Buddhist teaching, there's so much emphasis on inquiry, because it's on the basis of our own actually initial doubt that we begin to appreciate the Buddhist critique, that we begin to understand the points that are being made in the teachings. So that's not so much about just subscribing to whatever the church tells you. It's more about really being impressed with and appreciate the insights that are basic to the teachings. And that's where we don't just have a simple-minded trust or a simple-minded faith. That's where it begins to become something that really is substantial. So Stephen continues, this is perhaps a rather important point. If people ask you, oh, so you're a Buddhist, what do you believe in? You know, that sort of thing. Then you get that you go out for a cocktail party or some social gathering, and people sort of say, oh, you're a Buddhist. Then you're sort of expected to have these kind of beliefs that just sort of can pigeonhole you in this along the lines of general religion or just the cult that you happen to be subscribing to. So Stephen continues, what would you say? So speaking for himself, he says, I would probably reply that I try not to believe anything or take it on faith. Another way to put this is that such faith can be understood as not having correct view. So it is this thing about faith in the Buddhist context, it should really come on the basis of inquiry, critical thinking. And just sort of subscribing blindly doesn't necessarily bring about something that's insightful or what we could call correct view. He then says there are two other topics that are elaborated with respect to this term confidence. One is being mentally clear about the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are then identifying that there is an issue, there is some discomfort, there is stress, there's suffering of various kinds. And these aren't handed down from some external agent. And they're also not just basic to a meaningless, directionless universe. This is psychological conditions that come about, or rather, these are psychological experiences that come about due to particular conditions. So the Buddha talked about there is discomfort or there's suffering, but these are caused. They're not something that are thrown at us or just invariably bound to happen. And the Buddha then identified that the third noble truth, the truth of suffering, is that this condition is, the third noble truth is the truth of cessation, that this condition is curable. And that's then takes you to the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path. There's an actual course of remedy, something that we can do about this. And he says, when we are mentally clear about suffering, its cause, its end, and the path to that, there is confidence present. The other concerns karma. When we understand, when we are mentally clear about karma, its causes and its result, there is confidence present. And of course, like today, Tsongsa Gyalme Rinpoche was talking about karma. And the thing about karma is that it ultimately actually shows us how the whole phenomenal existence, our entire experience universally, is founded on causes and conditions. And as such, karma is really understanding how these causes and conditions work. They don't exist as absolutes, but they exist as an understanding of the actions that we do actually have an impact. Not just in terms of one action leads to one result, but an action and then followed up by particular circumstances leads then to particular experiences. But this also leads us to understanding that nothing really exists as inherently, absolutely existing. So the more we can understand karma, the more we understand the absence of some inherent absolute reality within phenomena. So he says then, for those who don't have a religious or spiritual bent, they can leave aside talk of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Maybe they can even leave aside talk about the Four Noble Truths, but surely they might be encouraged to think deeply on the relationship between their intentions and their subsequent experiences. So this, of course, is assumed. I would like to sort of course, Steven is right here. There might be some sense of spiritual allegiance when you talk about Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But again, I think if people or if there's an understanding of what Buddha and Dharma and Sangha really constitutes, then I think most people would actually be completely fine with it. We could say Buddha represents truth from the perspective of actually investigating reality rather than just wanting to be comfortable. So that's where the appreciation for the Buddha is really founded on an investigation that asserts the validity of the Buddha's insight into truth. So that doesn't necessarily entail us being religious or even spiritual. It actually entails us being prone to critical thinking. And the Dharma, similarly, also we could see not so much as a dogma or a set of prescribed ways of doing things, but rather as a critique. So that's where there's various ways we can approach this. But of course, at first glance, we might think, okay, faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, that's got to be basic to the Buddhists. But again, I would argue if this was properly understood, probably not really something that is about just embracing some belief, but rather about appreciating that there might be some insight available. And then he says, maybe they can even leave aside talk of the Four Noble Truths, but surely they might be encouraged to think deeply about the relationship between their intentions and their subsequent experiences. And this is something that we all can see and everybody knows. We might act in a particular way, and that just might backfire. And then we can ask ourselves, well, I might have acted in a very sort of, according to the social norms and conventions, I might have acted in a nice way. I might have done the right thing, but there might have been irritation or resentment behind it. So it's not just that we do the right thing and then it leads to a particular result. It has so much to do with, like Steven points out here, the relationship between their intentions and their subsequent experiences. So if we're kind to somebody, and there's this sort of double bind with an underlying sort of passive aggression, aggressive attitude, then we might be sort of ostensibly very kind to somebody, but somehow there's a place where this is being picked up, and we might not necessarily reap the benefit of what is only on a very superficial level a kind gesture. There might be somebody who can see through our masquerade, or also just things just happen where we actually probably might suspect that the sort of underlying intention might have influenced what we're experiencing. Anyway, he says, as they begin to see that there's a very close connection between these two, essentially then intention and experience, something might begin to occur. And that something is also called confidence. So that's where we can begin to have some confidence in karma, not just as the sort of the cliche about, what is it again, what is it, what goes around comes around, and, you know, instant karma, all of that. It's just your karma, man, and all of that. It's a bit more complex than that. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the words of my perfect teacher by Paltrimcha says that when one goes for refuge, this going means that one is learning what corresponds with true refuge. Refuge is a metaphor here. It means a shelter. Refuge refers to a true and real shelter that we can go to and that will protect us or bring us to a state of being completely beyond the wind and the rain of changing circumstances that cause upset and confusion. I mean, refuge is, of course, something we seek. As refugees, we try to get out of a war zone or a zone of conflict and find a place that's safe. And from the Buddha's point of view, as long as we're deluded within a dualistic confusion, then the very basis of our outlook is influenced by this delusion. And that's where we wouldn't want to just have something that temporarily sort of makes us feel good, but rather we would take refuge in something that ultimately really clears away the cause of suffering. So that's where taking refuge then makes sense. Paltramji also says that one of the indications that one has learned how to go for refuge is that increasingly this factor of confidence and trust is present in us. If we're not so confident or trusting from this point of view, among other things, perhaps there is a defect in our understanding of how to go for refuge. So, of course, here we're talking about taking refuge in the Buddha, but also confidence can very often come from a confidence that's not simply being aligned with the way that things are. We have quick understanding. Genuine sense of what is true or what is valid. So that's the first of the. So for those of you who are interested, then the term really is Shraddha in Sanskrit and Depa in Tibetan. But of course, when we're trying to translate these terms into English, there's a wide variety of options. And then again, these options that we invariably have to choose, such as the word faith, they actually cover quite well what the Tibetan and Sanskrit means. But the thing is, it comes with a whole cultural baggage. There's a whole history of what we might associate with a term like faith. So very often you have sort of kind Buddhist teachers that come to them and teach in the modern world, and they'll sort of emphasize how important faith is. And meanwhile, the audience has sort of been brought up to actually have a huge problem with the idea of faith. So that's where sometimes we can choose confidence and trust. But then again, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes faith has a very deep meaning, and also in terms of just our human relationships, which actually renders the word faith very valid translation as well. So there's these kind of issues that come up when we're trying to find a term for these concepts, which in traditional Buddhist cultures really are quite clear and straightforward. Okay, I'll see if there's some questions here. All right. Hi, Jakob. I sometimes come across the term faith in Buddhist texts. For example, the chapter on taking refuge in the words of my perfect teacher talks about vivid, hold on, about faith, eager faith, confident faith, etc. Is this a different sense of the term to the one Goodman is discussing here, or a different concept? No, that's pretty much it. And I was also looking in mind and Buddhist psychology before, and actually in there's quite some elaboration about what we mean with these. So these are essentially very much correspond to what Paltram is talking about in Words of My Perfect Teacher. Of course, what Steven is trying to do is present this material in a more contemporary context, right? And so the language is different, but more or less the same, yeah. So, defect in our understanding of how to go for refuge. Story of my Dharma life. Okay, yeah, there's a few of us, don't worry. And then, yeah, question was answered. Why is it that illusory relative phenomena follow laws so neatly? Like plant apple seed and get apple tree. If all phenomena is illusory or come from the mind, shouldn't we be able to get plant apple seed and get orange tree? I don't understand why illusion follows laws of cause and effect. Okay, great question. I happen to know you were in yesterday's class, I think, if I'm not wrong, about what we call expedient or provisional truth and absolute or definitive truth. And we have to understand when we say phenomena illusory, we're talking definitive truth. But, you know, within our experience, you could say our provisional experience, the issue of, or rather the observation, the fact that phenomena, they appear yet have no intrinsic existence ultimately, is not something that we live by. So while we might aspire to increasingly see things as illusory and be less held by our fixation and our delusional projections, right? We might aspire to that. We presently are very held by a conventional reality. We're held by time and space. And so within time and space, things follow very neatly. What happened in the past is what constructs the present moment, and the present moment is what constructs experience later on. And you can say that's very neat, but it's not particularly intelligent design. It's just the nature of dualistic phenomena and the whole nature of time and space. So that's where, yes, you will plant an apple, you put down an apple seed, and don't expect to get neither pumpkins nor oranges. You're going to be getting this very neat apple happening. And this is something that's empirical. And you know, in the Buddhist teaching, we operate very much with what is verifiable, what can be observed, and we can simply just say, hey, well, it seems that apple seeds create apple trees and nothing else. But we're also aware, and this is, if you like, this is where it gets, you know, it's much less of a one-shot deal, because it's much more complex than just saying, okay, apple seed makes apple tree, because if there's a lot of the right conditions, there's the manure, there's the sun, there's the rain, there's all the conditions, then you have a great flourishing apple tree. Where if these lack, you might have an apple tree, but it might be a very decrepit apple tree. So it's not all that neat, if you like, but there's definitely an understanding that it's causes and conditions that create effects. And this is something, again, that's verifiable or falsifiable, if you like. If faith, surety, certainty, what the 100,000 frustrations and refuge in Indra is trying to cultivate in our mind, it's this very factor, right? Yeah, again, it's a lot more complex than that, but sure, definitely. And the whole practice in Buddhism of taking refuge is essentially making the difficult choice to opt truth rather than just simple solutions. So that's, of course, where the Dharma is founded on our inquiry and not just a blind faith. Yeah. Okay. So, conscience, self-respect. And this is what in Tibetan then is called, this is such a good term in Tibetan, ngotsa. You know, ngotsa, ngotsa actually means face, and sa means hot face. It's actually embarrassment, but it's a personal thing. It's, again, it's where we feeling comfortable with ourselves. So it's conscience. You know, we can talk about having a clear conscience, and that's actually something that only we can know if we have a clean conscience or not. We could be putting on a show to the rest of the world of being very sort of respectable individuals. And that's where we need to have this quality of knowing ourselves. And the Tibetans then refer to this as hot face, actually the quality of self-respect. So the second wholesome factor, hari or shri, but I think it's hari, is translated as self-respect or having conscience. The great 14th century Tibetan Dzogchen master Longchenpa developed a rather interesting approach to talking about these factors. He said, in summary, that most people have no idea about karma, about causes and effects. To discover how this works is already a great revelation. And to discover that there are two ways in which karma operates is even more precise. That is to say, there are unwholesome and there are wholesome ways of proceeding. So we might just have the notion of just operating in reaction to circumstances. But the moment that we begin to think, and that already requires some self-reflection. What is it that I could do that would be more helpful and what is less helpful? And of course, this is not just about, you know, running a business or planting the garden. This is has a lot to do with about how we handle ourselves. So that's where already there, thinking in these terms is already, you could say, a revelation. So Stephen says, we already said that wholesome means it will be of benefit and we will feel good later. Unwholesome means the opposite. He said this factor of self-respect can be glossed as me or face and hot, which together makes hot face, thus referring to embarrassment. Let's see what Stephen says about this. Yeah, what's up? Yeah. So thus referring to embarrassment. That means that we have the capacity to know whether or not our life is in accordance with wholesomeness and unwholesomeness. And this again, just because Michelle brought this up earlier, I mentioned that the first one here is really setting us as the norm. That's where, do we want to do this? This is really just us judging ourselves. The next one that's going to follow has more to do with, is this what others would want us to do? Yeah. So that is, so knowing this, he says, I know the difference and I'm working with the difference. Yeah. If we're disturbed, if we're traumatized, we'll be scattered, we'll be chaotic, and then even the 10 factors of general functioning will be disturbed. We won't know how these good and wholesome factors work. We'll have the opposite going on, so it's a little bit difficult. So this is that it's not a given that we just necessarily can have the capacity to distinguish or discern. We might be challenged by negative circumstances, trauma, or inabilities of various kinds. So he says, but sometimes we say, this is wholesome, I should cultivate that. This is unwholesome, I should leave it alone. So of course, we might not particularly use the terms wholesome or unwholesome. We might just think of it in terms of constructive or helpful or not so helpful and so forth, but it amounts to the same thing. Stephen says, sometimes we have a little bit of space to note that something we are about to get involved in is unwholesome and shouldn't be practiced. It doesn't correspond to what is most basic from the viewpoint of spacious heart. From having not engaged in that action, even though provoked to do so, indicates this presence of self-respect, a conscience. Those who have a very shaky sense of self-respect have not been able to cultivate or stabilize this factor, right? So this is where I remember years ago I was in Idaho. Yeah, it's Idaho, next to Washington, right? Yeah, just across the border. Yeah, famous potatoes, right? Yeah. So anyway, I was in Idaho, and I was traveling as an interpreter for a Lama, and I had to go and buy a telephone card, and I gave the it was at a petrol tank, and I gave the person there, I gave them $20 or something like that, but I got change on 50. So I gave in a 20 note and I got back $35 or something like that, right? So I came out in the car and says, oh, they're very nice here. They changed me wrong. And the Lama's daughter, that's right, Palmo. This is now Kachimarimja. And I remember Palmo saying, what, you accepted that? You go straight in and give it back. And I was like, well, and I could see her point. I was sort of, okay, obviously the right thing, but of course I should have done it right there and then, yeah. So that's where, I was busted for lack of decorum there, a little bit of lack of conscience, yeah. Huh? Palma, oh, she was, I don't know, she was in her 20s or 30s, yeah. She was very embarrassing. Yeah, no, yeah. Could well have been a 5-year-old, So shame, decorum, on that note. The third factor, apachapa, and let's just see, this is in Tibetan is chelye, and this is then respectively translated as shame and decorum. The third factor is sometimes rendered as shame or decorum. These days, the English word shame does not have a good connotation. It sounds a bit abusive, as if we're blaming someone, right? And we talk about shaming somebody and so on. So Steven says, what does this factor connote? It is, in a way, similar to self-respect, and the two are often mentioned together, whereas self-respect has as its reference seeing that someone does not correspond with our true, has as its reference seeing that some behavior does not correspond with our true nature, and then not engaging in that behavior, leading to a growing sense of self-respect. Then here, decorum has to do with recognizing that a possible behavior with respect to a group affiliation, like being in a sangha or an intentional community, might be going against the norms of the group. Again, coming back to the messy front yard. Decorum is related to other groups of people, or perhaps a sangha situation where we're agreeing to a set of rules and procedures that are wholesome. We voluntarily entered into this agreement and we do our best. From time to time, we may note that we are being provoked to engage in an unwholesome action with respect to that group, meaning that we're about to go against the collective norms. So that's where we might be sort of tempted to just leave our garbage out in the front, and sort of just because we don't have time and we're tempted, it's just easier for us or whatever. And then after some time, there might be others that might be annoyed with that, right? So he says, we're not going against a set of coercive, imposed laws, but rather against the norms of an intentional community that is trying to bring about a greater situation of well-being. With that difference, both self-respect and decorum are similar. We're provoked, but there's a bit of space to know the difference between what is wholesome and unwholesome. When we know something is unwholesome and we do not engage in it, there is a feeling that one has, in a wholesome way, maintained a sense of self-respect and decorum. Whether it's with respect to a group or with respect to oneself, they both have to do with being on the brink of being provoked to engage in a wholesome action and not succumbing to perform the action. Actually, from the Buddha's perspective, then being provoked to sort of possibly engage in what is unwholesome and then not doing is actually seen as something that enhances our capacities. So there might be somebody who's sort of like tempting us to sort of, just leave your garbage out there, who cares, or whatever it might be, you know? And actually not succumbing to that actually strengthens us. So it's not just that we want to isolate ourselves from places where we're never provoked and where there's never kind of the situation of being on that brink, but it's actually more about, it's actually seen that we are actually strengthened through being, you could say, tempted or suggested that we could do otherwise. So Steven says we don't do it and we feel good. Longchenpa reminds us that having the knowledge that karma works in two ways, either in wholesome or unwholesome way, allows us to begin to work with what to do when we're tempted to engage in something unwholesome. So that's, again, this strengthens us, our resolve, so to speak. Perhaps it's useful to recall a phrase in the Pali version of the Vinaya that describes how one trains to avoid unwholesomeness. In spite of many translations which say, thou shalt not steal, kill, and so on, here the precise language is different. The phrase do not, or thou shalt not, this is of course sort of more sort of archaic translation, is not used. Rather, the term training, Pali, which is sikkam, is employed. One undergoes training in abstention from unwholesome actions. To this word is added the phrase step by step. Pali is padam. Thus we engage in stages to avoid. Thus we train in stages to avoid unwholesomeness. So again, this is very often the problem when translations sort of come across in archaic language. Then we again think, you know, there's some sort of absolute decree, but it's not so much as an absolute decree. It's just like you should check out not doing it. So it's not like there's an absolute right or wrong, but it's helpful. It's not as if when you buy a house, there's a decree that you have to tend to the lawn, but it's just if you want to have a nice house, it's nice to have a nice lawn, and you could possibly sort of just you could tend to the lawn and the garden. So it's not like, shall I make a garden or shall I make a lawn? It's just like, this is probably what you're going to be better off doing.
Like a muscle working, that the more you do it, the stronger it gets. So
Yeah.
the less you'll be influenced by that situation.
Mm.
But it takes training.
Yeah.
To do that.
Yeah, exactly. So the comment is it's something that we train in just like a muscle. Yeah, absolutely. It provides, I guess, more autonomy, right? We train in becoming more autonomous. According to the Sri Lankan Theravadan monk Bhante Sila Wimala, the word padam in this phrase has two meanings. One such meaning of stage is according to what your stage is in the practice of living according to the codes of conduct in the Vinaya. That is, according to whether you're a beginner, novice, monk or nun, or a more seasoned, ordained follower of the Buddha, a fully ordained monk or nun. The other sense of stage is according to your status in life. That is, whether you're a layman or a laywoman, a novice monk or nun, or a fully ordained monk or nun. One's training depends on one's status in those senses. The last part of the phrase, samadhyami, here samadhyami, I go, carries the sense of I'm voluntarily going or following this step-by-step training. Again, the commitment here is not about something that's absolute, but more in relation to just doing what's going to be helpful, particularly for ourselves, in terms of what our objective is, whether we're a fully ordained monk or if we're a layperson or whatever. It's just helpful for our particular situation. So Steven says, this means I'm going into it voluntarily. I'm gradually training myself in, for example, abstention from such and such. This is quite different from the directive, thou shalt not. Right. So according to these understandings, we're encouraged to train our ethical muscles, there you go, gradually according to our status and lifestyle. We learn to honor these codes of training in good conduct. The training programs are different depending on one's status in life, whether one is ordained monk or nun or is non-ordained householder. And even within those divisions of ordination, there are differences. The training of a novice or novice monk or nun is somewhat different from a fully ordained one, according to the number of vows they have taken. So, in conclusion, Steven says, I think we might refer to both self-respect and also decorum as the Buddhist equivalent of what in the West are called healthy boundaries. How might a Buddhist practitioner engage in healthy boundaries? The response might be that one is learning to work with provocations to engage in unwholesome activities. And when we don't, that is wholesome. I think we'll leave it at that here. See some questions. Ooh la la. Sounds a bit like a Zen joke. Change must come from within. Is that a Zen joke? It might have been the context. Sorry, I'm not sure what you're referring to here. If the word wise is synonymous with true, and wise words, wise, etc., are synonymous with truth, then to apply these in relation to the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path is the intention. Yeah, I mean, anything is, you could say, dependent or contingent on the intention. So the way that we would engage with the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path is strengthened on the basis of the particular intention. Yeah, I'm not sure if I got this. Conscience and shame sound like an innate, inbuilt ethic or morality. Well, that's exactly what we said it isn't. Yeah. That's exactly the point here, that we're both, from Steven and myself, we're making a point about that, yeah? Tsongsa Rinpoche did say ethics take backseat. Yes, exactly. That was also Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's point here today. That's right. Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche did say ethics take the backseat and wisdom and compassion take the front seat. Well, yeah, we would say he was saying the wisdom takes the driver's seat, yeah. But here it seems shame, conscience is like an inherent failsafe in our Buddha nature. Yeah, well, when Rinpoche said that, I was actually thinking it could almost be that wisdom is that the ethics can be the driver, and actually the boss is sitting in the back seat. If you have the situation of a limo, then the boss actually sits in the back seat, is not driving the car, and in fact is being driven by ethics. And that's where you could sometimes say that ethics could be given a preeminence. We would say it really depends again on the place where we're at, because we begin with ethics from the point of view that we're very much conditioned by our behavior. In fact, the whole of Western psychology, or a large part of Western psychology, is so much behaviorist. And we understand, cognitive science operates so much with identifying what's happening with an individual in terms of their particular reactive patterns, in terms of their behaviors, and so on. So that's where we, particularly in the modern world, we're very much married to behavior, very much married to ethics. So from the modern point of view, then ethics is a huge thing. So when we talk about the three trainings in Buddhism, we talk about initially ethical action, then we talk about meditation, and then as an outcome of that, we have wisdom. So while wisdom is the most important, it could be that wisdom is sitting in the back seat being driven by the other trainings. Yeah? Anyway, thank you for your questions, and we'll conclude the session now. Running a little bit over time. We'll conclude with dedication. Hi, welcome to. We're just finishing one section. Please make yourself comfortable. Yeah. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore and more. Okay. So we'll just take a 2-minute break, and then we'll begin the next component of the program. So welcome to the second component of the program, which is then meditation, where I'll just say a few things, some things about the basic principles about meditation, and then we shall do it. Of course, it's very difficult to give a complete introduction to Buddhist meditation in 20 minutes. But at the same time, I think it's possible to give some idea of what we're doing when we're doing meditation, particularly in a Buddhist context. Sometimes we hear that meditation is a place where we can go in and sort of recharge our batteries, and the inspiration might be that the world is a terrible place, and when we meditate, we kind of remove ourselves from the world. We kind of close our eyes and we go inward and away from it all. And Buddhist meditation is actually the exact opposite. It's actually giving the world a chance. We don't exclude the world, we don't exclude our perceptions, but we do allow for us to be present. What very often happens with us in the world is that we're caught up in thinking. We're caught up in our internal processes, and we're actually oblivious to the world. And it's in a way there that we fail to actually fully appreciate ourselves and our interaction with the world. And of course, what we're doing with the Abhidharma studies that we were just doing is very much identifying the processes that happen between us and our perceptions, and begin to understand really the complex nature of this, that it's not just a one-shot deal that is either good or bad, but there's so many different conditions that are there, which actually leave us quite empowered to work with a lot of our experience. What generally happens with us and the world is very much that we're continually imposing a particular quality of censorship, that we want this and we don't want that. And so we live in a continual battle really between good and bad, and the ways that we react very often stirs up a lot of afflictions. And there's not really a sense of acceptance with the realities that we're in. And as such, also, we're always operating with narratives that are uncomfortable with what's happening in the world. What we do with Buddhist meditation is that we begin to actually employ something we call mindfulness. And mindfulness really is the intention to be less caught up in our inner narratives and actually begin to be properly present with an acceptance of what is. So that's where Buddhist meditation doesn't necessarily retreating away from the world, but it means to actually be more present. So the beautiful thing of what we're proposing and what the Buddha's discovery was with his enlightenment is actually the intrinsic nature of each and every one of us, and the intrinsic nature of, you could say, the world, the phenomenal world as such, is good. There's nothing toxic. Of course, there's a lot of confused individuals and there's a lot of suffering, and we're not blind to that. But the basic disposition innate to everyone everywhere is a core of goodness, a core of sanity, of clarity, of brilliance even. And same way also, the world in which we live is innately pure. So that the objective with the Buddhist practice of meditation, the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, and also vipassana, is very much for us to begin to connect with this goodness within ourselves and also in our relationship to the phenomenal world. But the first place that you could say the world itself is already perfect as it is. Of course, we're not talking about all the persons within the world that on the basis of confusion are, you could say, perpetuating suffering for themselves and others, but we are talking about the innate quality of our reality. And for us to connect with that, we could say reality as such exists as it does, but the way that we interact with this reality is really what makes this reality. And that's where then the practice of meditation is really that we begin to connect with reality without the normal imposition of our projections, our belief in our, you could say, naive subscription to our projections and beliefs and so on, and the various storylines, narratives with which we actually continually censor and navigate within our interaction with the world. So that's where the practice of meditation is actually where we begin to relinquish some of these habitual ways that we interact. It provides a freshness in which we are present. But to do that, we actually need to do more than just say, okay, I'm never again will I be judgmental, or never again will I fall for my habitual impulses. We actually need to take into account the habitual strength, the strength of our habits and the way that they actually rule us. So there has to be that initial humble recognition that we are, you could say, a work in progress. But at the same time, there's definitely the notion that we're curable. There's absolutely no notion that we're stuck being in one way or another. But the implication of meditation, and this is where sometimes there's a little bit of confusion, is that we actually provide a structure, a framework, a peaceful structure and framework where we're not carried away by these narratives and storylines that inevitably grip us, hold us, and with which we very often are just very submissive and in fact allow them to control us. This is where we're a little bit taking control and a little bit developing a sense of autonomy by looking at them, being aware of them, but not necessarily tagging along with them. And that's not that easy. And the reason why in the Buddhist tradition, why we sit, is that this actually provides a context in which we can be conscious of what's happening in our mind, but not carried away with it. Of course, if we've been promised that meditation is going to be this place where you sit down, you're not going to have any thoughts, then we're going to be sorely disappointed, because we're not only going to have thoughts as we usually have them, but we're going to be aware of all the thoughts that we're normally maybe not aware of. That's where we'd rather just, maybe sometimes when we are sort of stressed out, then we'd rather just, rather than just be peaceful, we'd rather be doped by TV or some sort of entertainment, so we don't have to be aware of all the thoughts that we're having. So there's very often a little bit of a discomfort, a sort of uncomfortable relationship with our own psychology. And that's actually where the practice of meditation is actually not where we stop thoughts, but where we actually learn to be comfortable with whatever thoughts they are without them necessarily driving the show and without them necessarily gripping us to the same extent. So when we sit down and meditate, it's not as if we're not going to have thoughts, but we're training in being aware of thoughts and not necessarily tagging along with them. And that's where the practice of mindfulness is radically different from the way in which we very often think of our experience of our being, which is very much that I'm having this thought and I'm having that thought and I wish I wasn't having that thought. The practice of mindfulness is actually that we are not worried about whatever psychological material that might surface, because we sustain an awareness that is not entangled in those thoughts. And what that practically means, how we effectively achieve that, is having an object of mindfulness, which is then, in the present case, then our breath. So as we're meditating, embarrassingly simple as it might sound, what we do when we meditate is really just that we're attentive to the breath. We sit and then we're attentive to the breath. That might sound very disappointing if we thought meditation, that's where we're going to sort of go on some particular spiritual journey. But it is radical, because if we were to go on some spiritual journey, we would just become addicts of a new trip, and we'd sort of be resentful when we came back to planet Earth and we had to relate to death and taxes and the kitchen sink and shopping and the sort of ordinary life. And then we'd sort of have a little bit of a split scenario where I have my meditative side, and then I have sort of resentfully I have my ordinary, very pedestrian life. We'd like to break that down. And what actually we discover with our ordinary life is that it actually has a natural luminous quality when we are not continually engaged in this very stressful process of censorship. It's not that we shouldn't be discerning, but very often we lack that aerial perspective in which we actually see things clearly, properly, without necessarily our projections and storylines. So to effectively achieve this, we have an object of mindfulness. And that is then, as we're sitting and meditating, we come back to the breath. So the objective with simply just coming back to the breath is that thoughts will arise, the same old thoughts that we always have, but we are not giving them the traction. They come with their own particular Velcro, and they might be a little bit miffed that they're not sort of getting the red carpet treatment and the sort of the drama that normally accommodates our sort of thinking and so on. And when we just acknowledge that thoughts are there and come back to the breath, they actually don't get that grip. They don't have that hold on us. And that's where it makes for a radically different experience. That's where we're not just practicing something that's isolated to a period of meditation, but it's something that actually helps us throughout our entire interaction with the world around us, with other persons, and so on. So this is where, on the basis of not being held by the ordinary storylines, attitudes, and so on, we begin to gain some autonomy. We begin to have some freedom from the grip that the ordinary narratives have on us. And that is where we speak about vipassana, which is wider perspective. Of course, vipassana sometimes is understood as a particular method of meditation. But the vipassana term itself is widely used in Buddhism. And it's not just limited to a particular meditation, but it really just means this grander perspective that really is what we could call wisdom. That is, when we begin to see things beyond just the perspective of our own self. And that's where wisdom also comes with really the quality of compassion. Because once we sort of be able to extract ourselves from just our self-centering, there becomes this increased awareness of the world in which we are situated and an increased awareness of others. And so that's where also in the Buddhist teaching, we talk about no self or anatta, which really is this perspective of a wider perspective that sees things not just from our own vantage point, but includes the perspective of others. But all of that comes back to this very simple exercise of initially creating a condition of the mind where the ordinary dramas and the ordinary reactive patterns are actually acknowledged as being there as part of our psychology, a part of our pattern, etc. But we don't really want to run away from them. We simply just look at them and acknowledge that they're there. Just like in the classical scriptures, we talk about just like clouds, they don't necessarily disturb the sky. The waves on the surface of the ocean don't necessarily disturb the depth of the ocean. And so we appreciate how the phenomena that we inevitably will experience don't necessarily constitute disturbance. And settling into that is really the purpose of meditation. And this is more about us connecting with ourselves and connecting with the world in which we are. So that's the sort of basic intention behind the practice of meditation. In terms of how we actually do this, there's three aspects to the technique that I'm presenting here. Of course, all the different Buddhist traditions, they have different techniques. This comes particularly from the Tibetan Mahamudra and Mahasandhi traditions. But we are using three aspects. One has to do with our body, and the next has to do with mindfulness of breath, and then it has to do with our thinking. So the first is then our posture, and we certainly don't need to be sitting on the floor. The main thing is really that we have a straight spine, that we hold ourselves with our lower back and have a straight spine, have generally a condition in which we would say the nadis or the meridians, they are straight. Then also the energy, the prana, or the chi runs straight. And then as a consequence of that, then the mind is also clearer. And also this quality of sitting provides a physical peace which very much enables us to have a more wholehearted relationship to our physicality, our body. The whole somatic aspect of who we are is very much enhanced by just sitting, and not necessarily sitting stiffly or rigidly, but just actually sitting and properly feeling our body and being grounded through connecting with our body. So in addition to having a straight spine, we also take the shoulders slightly back, we take the chin in, we lower the gaze, but in this particular method, we don't close our eyes. Of course, if we're used to closing our eyes, that's fine, but there's a certain value in not excluding any of our perceptions. So we're not necessarily disturbed by the field of vision, and also we are not disturbed by sounds or smells or whatever. We're allowing these perceptions to take place. But we do this with continually just coming back to an awareness of being present. So in this way, we keep the eyes a little bit lower. There's less distraction when the eyes are lowered. If you look at the Buddha and the sages, you'll always see that they have sort of what we could call samadhi eyes, which are sort of just there's a little bit of the eye that's open. And then we relax the jaw. If we need to breathe through the mouth, we can do that. And then what else? Hands on the knees, or if you like, hands in the lap, whichever serves better. So these are the basics of the physical posture, and that's the first point. The second is then bringing the mind back to the breath, and that's where the focus of our attention goes. So in general, we have to recognize that our mind is rather all over the shop, and we tend to be thinking about this, that, and our attention goes everywhere. But here in this case, we focus on the breath. This brings us back to being present. And while we could hope for some particular state of mind in meditation, actually here when we're meditating, we're not sitting waiting for some particular state to happen. What we're doing in the practice of meditation is that we are sitting, connecting with our physicality, with the body, and then with our attention, we're simply just focusing on the undistracted quality of being aware of the breath, and particularly the out breath. One Tibetan teacher compares it to the slide. When we, as kids, we go on the slide, we sort of really enjoy the going down with the slide. And then we sort of run around, which is not really part of the whole fun, you know. In fact, the longer the slide is, the better, right? So then we don't have to go back. Or like skiing, actually, yeah. So then you sort of just have to get back up on the hill again, and then you have fun because you're going down. So similarly, also in this particular technique, we focus on the out breath, again, because it's something that actually connects us with the other, with the space that we're in. So we follow the out breath as it goes out, and we're aware of that. And then we relax the mind. We simply just let there be a gap until we breathe out again. So in this way, the focus is not sort of an uninterrupted trance. It's more just that we're present and not distracted. We're not particularly interested in going into trance. What we are interested in, however, is to have a reference where we have some antidote for being just tagging along or dragged away with or absorbed in our distracted thinking. So that's where simply just coming back to the breath to the out breath is the second point. The last is how we handle all the various thoughts, emotions, and psychological phenomena that inevitably are continually happening within our consciousness. And that's where we choose, you could say, the anchor of awareness of the breath as something that actually connects us to be present. We probably would be aware that very often we're simply not present. We could actually drive from one end of town to the other without actually necessarily being present. We're just running on autopilot, literally. And the mind is so habituated to being simply absorbed in distracted states of mind. And that's where the practice of meditation is radical, because this is actually where we train ourselves in being fully present. So meditation, despite what it looks like, has nothing to do with going into a particular zone, a particular state. It is really just cultivating this ability to be connected and to be present, but with the humble awareness that without the sort of right structure, we inevitably are carried away by distraction. Now, when we practice meditation, then we have the usual thoughts, and we shouldn't resent having thoughts. We shouldn't think, now my meditation is really good because I didn't think of any of those things I don't want to think about. Rather, it's more about being present, and just the simplicity of it lies in that we just come back to the out breath. We don't necessarily evaluate what comes up. We have this attitude that we might have all sorts of thoughts come up, but we label them all as simply just thinking. And that, of course, is, you could say, well, that's not dealing with the thoughts. Well, it's actually providing a place where we can have some space. We can have a breather. And of course, when we're not meditating, sure, we need to use our thoughts, we need to deal with things, etc., etc. But the thing is, when we begin to have this spaciousness in relation to our psychological material, it actually allows us to have a wider perspective, that actually thoughts could arise, but we don't necessarily kowtow to them as being incredibly authoritative, and simply just allowing the thoughts to arise without necessarily giving them all that attention and not allowing them to have that traction on us. It enables us to be able to experience whatever psychological material that arises, and yet to make choices without necessarily being driven by or controlled by these thoughts. And that's where it's very helpful then to have this wider perspective that is provided when we're not necessarily being controlled by the thoughts. So it never means that we won't have the thoughts, but it means that we could be not distracted as thoughts arise. So with that, we actually, interestingly, are doing something that bursts a bubble of self-involvement. And that's where we very often would see that the natural expression of meditation really is compassion, that the natural outcome for persons who practice meditation is that the natural manifestation is compassion. So we very often would see this with sages. The sage is not someone who just retreats to a cave and then thinks the rest of the world they've completely sort of below them, but rather the sage is someone who, with the degree to which there's greater freedom, has greater empathy for the world. So of course this we see embodied in many of the great Buddhist teachers. Anyway, these are the you could say the basic components of meditation. So these are then the three aspects of the technique, which is the posture, then the breath, which is then the object of mindfulness, and then finally the way that we relate to the material. Whatever thoughts arise, we simply just label them thinking and come back to the breath, and this providing then this greater perspective. So that's the actual technique of meditating. Now here we always preface this, and in all the various Buddhist traditions, there's always, you usually would preface what we call meditation without form with some degree of form. Like in the Theravadan tradition, one would sometimes chant scriptures. And very would preface Vajrayana tradition and Tibetan tradition, particularly. It might be mean that we think of some great person, and simply just seeing the face of some great person or thinking of the Buddha already puts us in a different space. So we preface the practice of meditation with this particular practice, which in the Buddhist tradition we call Buddha Anusmriti. So of course this is composed within a the Buddhist within a Buddhist context of Tibet, and so the language that we have in there might be different from many of us who within modernity very often have a very sort of critical relationship to authority and so forth. But the intention behind this is really the bhakti or the devotion that recognizes the potential that is present within everyone and which is manifest within great teachers. So we don't see the Buddha as a savior or some great God, but we acknowledge the Buddha as a great teacher who embodies qualities that we naturally have, but which the Buddha then manifested. And so in that way, actually, the invoking the image of the Buddha or the presence of the Buddha is something that actually breaks down our own confusion and really creates the cause for developing the quality of the inner Buddha. So in this way, strangely enough, what we have in the Buddhist tradition in terms of shrines, in terms of honoring teachers and so on, is the exact opposite of what we within egalitarian philosophy, you could say, see as being a discrepancy or a hierarchy. These exercises actually facilitate the breaking down of hierarchy. It actually facilitates the breaking down of duality. So that's why it's always it's something that's really key within the Buddhist tradition, and as such, then the practice that we're going to be doing here will just chant this particular liturgy to begin with, and then we'll practice meditation. So the liturgy itself takes about 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, and then it's followed by meditation proper, where we'll be sitting first 15 minutes, and that's where you practice what I was just explaining before. And then we do 5 minutes of mindful walking, which in one way is of course a relief. If we've been sitting and we're not used to sitting, it might be a sort of a relief for our knees. But also, it's also a way of integration, because sometimes we just think of mindfulness as something that we do in terms of sitting down, but it's also something we can do when we move. When we're doing walking meditation, then we're more attentive to the foot. So while we're sitting, we're attentive to the breath. Then when we're doing the walking meditation, we're more attentive to the footstep. So then we do, we sort of walk counter, what's it called? What's it called? Clockwise? Clockwise. We walk clockwise here in a circle for 5 minutes, and then again we sit for 15 minutes, and then we'll conclude. All right, so we'll just have a 2-minute break where you can just stretch your legs or whatever you need to do, and then we'll begin. Thank you. All right, I guess we'll begin. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in equanimity. Just keep going without me. Ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perceptions of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased. And may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us drift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness caring for us with compassion. Every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Jayata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. Now, we usually conclude with this thing called the aspiration prayer of Maitreya. And it comes from the Ratnakuta, which is part of a larger scripture called the Avatamsaka Sutra. And this is an enormously lengthy sutra. But in there, there's this aspiration to follow the example of Maitreya. It's actually not Maitreya himself who's making this aspiration prayer, but somebody aspiring to become like Maitreya. But essentially, this is an aspiration to follow in the footsteps of the bodhisattvas. So, of course, in the Buddhist teaching, we're not really supplicating somebody out there, but rather with what we mean with prayer is really just making an aspiration and laying down, you could say, the intention. So this sort of outlines the rather extensive aspirations of the bodhisattva, not in the sense of being ambitious really, but more in the sense of just making, you could say, laying down some noble intentions. So that's what this is. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created, through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disinterested, endowed with the flawless great merit ethics that is guided by rules and the effective paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas station through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra. May I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration, through actualizing the three gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the three times, and the three types of knowing as well. May I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavachan jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you, everyone. As usual, you are invited down at Michelin's if you'd like to have a bite.